Thanks everyone for showing up. As Anon mentioned, I am the lead investigator on the State of DevOps reports. And what this is it's actually the world's largest research investigation into what makes high performance. And really, what is DevOps, or at least what we're calling DevOps? So it's really software development and delivery. We have data from over 23,000 teams around the world into how they make software. So I've been partnering up with the team at Puppet for the last 4 years. This year we're partnering up with Google. And my other co-collaborators are Gene Kim, if anyone here has heard of the Phoenix Project. Okay, and also Jez Humble, if anyone here has heard of continuous delivery. Okay, so this is the core team driving this research. We've also just written up a book called Accelerate, which summarizes and consolidates everything that we found over the last 4 years in detail. And I realize that so often people come to me and they say, what have you found? What's the most important thing? Or what are the biggest surprises? And so here's kind of a summarization of some of the things that we found, me and Gene and Jez, that are the most fun things or the biggest surprises or what we share with some of our customers when we work at Dora. And so Dora is kind of the company that we've put together that runs the research and then offers assessments to companies to help them really accelerate their transformation. So here we go. This is what we'll run through today. The first one is that technology matters. And I'm sure you're laughing, but I'll talk about why this is actually a thing to talk about. Next up is that maturity models don't work. I'm sure right now some of you are cringing and telling me that I'm a horrible person, but it's fine. I'll explain why this is real. The next is that transformations need technology and process and culture. Then we'll talk about architecture and technology and the surprises there. So definitely stick around if anyone here is related to technology in any way, or if you're running a company and you want to know how to do this the right way. Then we'll talk about how to accelerate your own journey. And then leadership matters. Who here's in leadership? Who here has a leader? Okay, perfect. And then how we can make our work better, and then what you can do to help. So let's get started. The first one is that technology matters. So hopefully we all are here because we believe that technology makes a difference. But for the longest time, we actually didn't have any evidence that it mattered at all. Nicholas Carr wrote a paper in Harvard Business Review titled, "IT Doesn't Matter." It was published in 2003. And because the title was IT Doesn't Matter, and because it appeared in Harvard Business Review, every executive read it, or at least read the title of the paper, and was like, sweet, I'm done, right? So everyone here, I'm sure, has heard IT is a cost center, and has heard it way too many times. That sucked, right? So we're like, sweet, we're all done. We can just go home, we can go work in a coffee shop. Like, our job here is done. The challenge is that Nicholas Carr actually had a really good point. The data that was pulled for the research that went into this paper came out of the 80s and the 90s, where the way we did technology was different from how we did it today. That's a teaser. I'm going to come back to the details here. But what we found in the research over the last 4 years is that DevOps is good for technology. So what do I mean by this? I mean, when we have measured DevOps, we've talked about software delivery performance. So this is both speed and stability, which is sort of interesting, because if anyone here is familiar with ITIL, we've sort of heard, or it's been whispered in dark alleys, that we don't get both, right? We've heard, or it's been suggested, that in order to be stable, we have to slow down, or maybe the reverse. This is how we measure it. For speed, we measure deployment frequency, or at least when the business demands, and lead time for changes. This is code commit to code deploy. Now for our stability measures, we're looking at MTTR, mean time to recover, and we're looking at change fail rate. Now, here's what we found. Software delivery performance is comprised of both, and both are possible without trade-offs. Let me say it again. This is the only thing you get out of this whole presentation. Both are possible without trade-offs. So let me make a quick aside. When I run this analysis, I take these 4 measures, deployment frequency, lead time for changes, MTTR, and change fail rate, and I like throw them in the hopper, right? I throw them in this like big bucket, and I run this analysis. And I say, how do these things fall? How do they cluster? It's called cluster analysis, right? They fall into groups. All 4 years in a row, they fall into very similar looking groups where there's this group where all 4 of them hang out up here, and then there's a big gap. And then all 4 of them hang out here in statistically significant ways. And then there's a gap. And then all 4 of them hang out down here, and they're all sucking, right? So we have a really good group, a mediocre group, and then like a group that is doing poorly. And I'm really creative, so I call them high performers and medium performers and low performers. And so that's what we're seeing all 4 years in a row. That's what I mean when I say software delivery performance is both throughput and stability. And I'm not seeing trade-offs anywhere. Okay, so we're also seeing that DevOps is good for organizations. So what do I mean by this? High-performing technology organizations, okay, this high group, they're twice as likely to achieve or exceed commercial goals. Productivity, profitability, market share. We studied this the first 3 years, and we were always getting this 2x number. And then the 4th year, we were like, wait, what about additional goals? Other things are also important, right? We also care about effectiveness and efficiency and customer satisfaction. And so in the 4th year, we also measured this. And we found this 2x number held. By the way, this is true for both nonprofits and for-profit organizations, because we know that for-profit organizations care about this as well. Now, for bonus points, the first year we ran this, I had a large enough data set to capture publicly traded stock market data, and we found that the high performers had a 50% higher market cap growth over the previous 3 years. So we really are excelling in the market. This isn't just my data, so you don't just have to trust me. Eric Brynjolfsson out of MIT has found this as well in 2008, as well as James Besson in Boston University in 2017. This was published in HBR, showing that superstar firms are pulling away from the pack as long as they're using technology plus additional things. I'll get to this in a minute too. Okay, next up. Maturity models don't work. They just don't. Not only that, maturity models are for chumps. This is bad news. Who here has played World of Warcraft? Who here has heard of World of Warcraft? Who here has a friend that plays World of Warcraft? It's fine, we're all friends. Okay. This was the world when World of Warcraft first came out, early 2000s. Okay, so let's create a maturity model for World of Warcraft. You're with me here? It's fine, let's make fun of Nicole. I used to play World of Warcraft when I was in my PhD program. It was amazing. It maybe kept me from finishing my PhD, so I stopped playing World of Warcraft. Here we go. So when it first came out, it went up to, I have notes to make sure I remember, level 60. Okay, that was as high as we could go. We had 2 lands, right? We have 2 worlds, 2 lands. There were certain tooling and technologies and weaponry we could use, right? So let's make our maturity model. We can go to, let's say, level 40, and 1 land is good. Level 50, and 1 land plus getting to the other is great. And level 60, and going to all of both lands is amazing. That is our maturity model. That sounds good. We're all on board with our maturity model? I don't care, I like it. And I am our local expert, so this is our maturity model, because also, by the way, maturity models are made up. This is our maturity model. Okay. This is now the world in World of Warcraft. The landscape has changed. Like literally the landscape has changed. There is now more worlds available to explore. You can now get to level 110. Also, there is more tooling, there is more technology. There are now pets. By the way, this should sound real familiar to technology today, to the business landscape today, to what customers expect today, right? the maturity model that I just described is no longer appropriate or applicable, right? Getting to those 2 lands and getting to level 60 isn't even close to being good enough. It's the same thing for us if we're trying to deliver value to our customers, right? I mean, how many years ago Docker wasn't a thing, Kubernetes wasn't a thing. What customers expect and demand has drastically changed. I've seen the same thing just in the last 4 years of running the State of DevOps report. What the most innovative, high-performing companies are delivering year over year over year is changing every single year. So, what do we see among our high performers? When I compare that high-performing group and that low-performing group, this is what I see. They're more agile. So when I look at those speed numbers, we see 46 times more frequent code deployments. That's the difference between multiple times a day and once a week or less. I also see 440 times faster lead time from code commit to code deploy. Now, occasionally people will say, why do I care about moving faster? This is what allows us to pivot when we need to pivot. This is what lets us delight our customers. If you are super lucky and you don't have any competition, this is what allows us to keep up with compliance and regulatory changes. Now, our high performers are also more reliable and more stable. I see 96 times faster MTTR from downtime. High performers recover in less than an hour instead of several days. Several days, low performers are still down sometimes. Can you imagine being down several days? By the way, this is the median. This is not even the worst of my low performers. This is my typical low performer. Now, if I look at change fail rate, high performers are only 1/5 as likely that their changes will fail. And this is not completely going down. This is just looking at any type of remediation or attention being required when you introduce a change into your system. Now, this is a little bit of an eye chart, but see where your teams might fall. I do run this analysis at the team level because we know in large organizations we have teams at very different levels. Notice in particular that high performers are doing well at everything. Okay. Next up, transformations need technology and process and culture. So, the way we've been defining DevOps, or these technology transformations, is part technical practice that's seen in continuous delivery, because that's really an all-encompassing set of practices. Management practices that draw largely from lean and agile canon, and organizational culture and leadership. And as I just mentioned, these drive organizational performance and technology performance. So let's get back to what Nicholas Carr said earlier in this HBR article in 2003. He said IT doesn't matter. And I mentioned that he sort of had a point. His point was that much of the data he was pulling from in the 80s and the 90s was looking at organizations buying a technology solution, plugging it in, and walking away. That doesn't really work. I can't fault companies for doing that because I love it when I can just look at something on my to-do list, check it off, and walk away and get credit for it. The problem is that everyone else can do the exact same thing. If I can buy a server and plug it in and be done, the problem is that so can any one of my competitors. So all it does is it helps me keep up but never get ahead, even if I do hard things like ERP systems. It gives me a point of parity. I keep up because I'm doing things faster that I shouldn't be doing by hand, right? Let's not do accounting by hand, let's not do HR by hand. But it doesn't give me a point of distinction. So what DevOps does is it helps me create value in ways that are distinct and unique, and in ways that my competitors cannot do. Think about the things that I want to do as a company that uniquely create value that I don't want anyone else to do. That's not something I can buy off a shelf, right? Again, that needs to be done with Tech Plus. So an original definition of DevOps was CAMS, culture, automation, measurement, and sharing. Although I'm really fond of a next one that includes that L, right? COMS, culture, automation, lean, measurement, and sharing. Now, we've also found in our research over the last 4 years that it's technology plus lean management plus culture. Now, as I mentioned, James Besson found in his HBR article, the real reason superstar firms are pulling ahead, it's because of IT combined with other things, like management, brand, or IP. And it's this strategic use of technology explains revenue and productivity gains more than things like M&A or entrepreneurship. Okay, some of my other favorite interesting, fun surprises are that architecture matters, but technology doesn't. Who here has heard before that, like, of course these companies like Amazon or Netflix can do amazing things because they're building something brand new. But like, I'm at a bank and I'm doing something with really hard old systems, so I can't make it work. I hear this all the time, right? So here's what we found. The technology or the technology stack doesn't matter. Now, I did find that low performers are more likely to be working on software developed by an outsourcing partner, and they're more likely to be working on a mainframe system. Okay, this is just more likely. But working on a mainframe system isn't statistically correlated with performance. And working on a greenfield or a brownfield or any other system isn't correlated with performance either. Okay, so then what actually matters? This is what actually matters. Being able to look at how your systems are architected. Walk through all of these and ask these questions. Can my team make large-scale changes to the design of its system without having to talk to other people and get a lot of permissions? Can my team complete its work without fine-grained communication? Can I deploy? Can I test on demand? Can I do deployments during regular business hours? What it really comes down to is having an architecture that allows you to deploy and test and communicate. And this is architecture dependent, right? We can do this with APIs. I can do this with service-oriented architecture. I've worked with customers and clients that can do this on mainframe systems, on green screens, on firmware. And I've talked to startups that are brand new that fail real hard at this because they architected it poorly. Granted, it's going to be a little harder to pull this off on mainframes. It's going to be a little more of a challenge, but this is the key. The interesting thing is that it talked about architecture, but it also talked about people and teams. So it sounds a lot like Conway's Law, which I think gives me DevOps bingo, right? It's not a DevOps talk unless you talk about either Deming or Conway. So here we go. Organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. So people often ask me, what's the perfect organizational design? There is not one. But the more levels of organization design and checks that you build into your system, the harder it is to communicate with other teams. You end up building it into your tech. That's going to make it real hard. Now, here's an interesting story. Our culture and our communication embeds itself into our technology, and it changes the way things work. And my favorite example comes from the robots at NASA. One of my good friends, Janet Vertesi, is a sociologist at Princeton. She did her postdoc at JPL, Jet Propulsion Labs. And she was telling me this story about the scientists that work on robots. So we can compare these two systems, and it really talks about the communication structures and how it gets embedded in the robots. So you can compare Curiosity, the Mars rover team. And they were structured in this relatively recent cross-functional team way. So the way this robot was built, as many functions as possible were kind of embedded into a single tool. The team worked closely together. At the end of every meeting, you would go around the room, go around the table, and every scientist had to say, "I am happy." And if the scientist was not happy, the meeting wasn't over. Now, contrast that to Cassini. Now, Cassini went around either Jupiter or Saturn. But this is like a years old mission. Now, this was built in a very different time, right? Let's think about the 80s and how things were structured in the 80s, right? We had very, very different siloed teams. Every team had their very own measurement instrument. So, the way that works, oh, and by the way, like it's been built, it is shipped. We cannot reorg this robot, right? Like, I don't know about you. I was at IBM for years. We reorged like every 6 months. It's fine. You can't reorg once it's been built into hardware and shipped. Like, this is gone. Every time you want to take a measurement around the planet, you have to physically like move this robot because it has to be pointing at what you want to take a measurement on. When that team starts fighting, Cassini starts breaking, even when they're not touching dials. Communication and culture affects our technology. Imagine what happens when the technology is like next to us. Okay. You can accelerate your journey. Transformations are important, right? We've seen that it impacts our ability to develop and deliver software, and that ability to develop and deliver software drives outcomes like profitability, productivity, market share, customer satisfaction. So how do we accelerate this? We know that key capabilities drive software delivery performance. They fall into a few categories: tech and automation, process, measurement and monitoring, and culture. I'm going to give you a big list. Some of our tech and automation capabilities that have been statistically shown to drive improvements are things like use of version control, right? This makes sense. And it's not just for your application. It's also for your infrastructure and for your config. Deployment automation, continuous integration, trunk-based development, test data management, shifting left on security, right? Don't just pen test right before you go live and then like desperately hope you can include just a few things. Continuous delivery, having that loosely coupled architecture that I talked about, and architecting for empowered teams. Now, process as well. These draw, again, from that lean and agile canon. Gather and implementing customer feedback, because that's who's important. Working in small batches. By the way, this will also help you with things like having a loosely coupled architecture, and CI and CD. Having a lightweight change approval process, and team experimentation, because your teams are your experts. One good example of this is some of the work that we did with Capital One. They realized that some of their core constraints were trunk-based development and a change approval process. So by focusing on their two core things, they saw a 20x improvement in releases in only 2 months with 0 increase in incident. Now, some additional capabilities that have been shown to be predictive. Visual management, so having good dashboards. Monitoring for business decisions, so proactive monitoring and then actually using that monitoring information and not just ignoring your pages at 2 o'clock in the morning. WIP limits and visualizations. So again, a good example from Capital One, Hygieia is an open source dashboard that they've developed, and they are now working on developing it even more with some of the teams at Verizon. Culture, of course, is super important. So Westrum organizational culture is one, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Having a good climate for learning. Having teams that are excited to learn and having an organization that helps support that. Collaboration among teams, right? We've talked about breaking down silos. I'm sure you've heard that in DevOps. Making work meaningful and transformational leadership. So within Westrum, we adopted this typology. It comes from a sociologist named Ron Westrum. He studied organizational culture in high-risk, highly complex fields like healthcare, nuclear power, and aviation. And he found that certain types of culture are predictive of safety outcomes. We've studied this for the last several years and found that it is also predictive of outcomes in technology, because we're also high-risk and complex. So as we go through and we look at things like pathological power-oriented culture, it's typified by low cooperation. The messenger is shot, right? We blame the person that brings us the bad news. Bridging is discouraged, right? Like, I don't want to hear from another group. Failure leads to scapegoating, and novelty is crushed. Who here has a friend that might work in this type of an environment? Okay, a few. Across our data set, we have about a quarter of our responses here. Now, bureaucratic and rule-oriented. Modest cooperation. Messengers are kind of ignored if they bring us bad news. Narrowly defined responsibilities. Bridging's tolerated. Failure leads to justice, right? We see this quite a bit. Novelty leads to problems. About 55% of our data set falls here. Who here may have a friend in this type of an organization? Okay, a few here. Now, the final culture. Again, this is most highly correlated with our high-performing groups. High cooperation. Messengers are trained. So what this means is we want to train people to bring us bad news so we can uncover what's happening in our organizations to improve it, right? Risks are shared. Bridging's encouraged. I want to reach across and figure out what's going on at all places of the organization. Failure leads to inquiry, right? Use of postmortems or retros is a good example of this. Novelty is implemented. Who here has a friend that works in an organization like this? Who here has no friends? Okay. Now, where should we start? People ask me so often, I'm on my own DevOps journey, where should I start? The honest answer is it depends. If you ask anyone that question, they give you an answer, they're lying, okay? They're full of it, they're lying. The answer is always it depends. Everyone's different. It depends on where you are in your organization, right? That maturity model, that's also why maturity models are like wrong. Okay, however, right, here's some of the things that I see very often that I can say. In the 2017 State of DevOps report, architecture was the highest contributor to continuous delivery. So what that means is, for all of the data I collected around the world, architecture was a very strong contributor. So for all of the, for that cohort, it was very strong. And also for the assessments that I run commercially, trunk-based development and having a loosely coupled architecture ends up being a strong constraint. So when I collect all of that data, that ends up being the thing slowing people down the most. Okay, so that is likely a good candidate for you. Also, having a lightweight change approval process ends up being a constraint for most teams. Again, take a look at where you are. What is slowing you down? These two may be good candidates. Continuous integration is also a good idea. Now, the one caveat here is take a look at what continuous integration actually is and not just what you've defined it to be. Many organizations redefine it because someone decided you have to be good at CI, so you redefine it so that you are then good at CI. So take a look at some of our research. It means things like when you check in code, it automatically triggers a build of software. It automatically triggers tests. It means that your code feedback is available within 10 minutes. It means that you prioritize having workable code and a workable build, right? It's hard, it's difficult, but that is also what enables several other things to take place. Okay, so what can you do? As I just mentioned, identify your constraints and pick a few. I worked with a customer several months ago. They had 50 initiatives. That's going to be real hard. It's difficult for people to focus on 50 things at once. Pick 2 or 3 or 4. Okay? Work to eliminate those constraints. In theory of constraints, we call that elevating the constraint. Work to eliminate that constraint. Reevaluate. You'll then have something else be the bottleneck. That's fine. But that's how you accelerate your journey. That's what allows you to leapfrog the competition. This should be seen as an exciting journey. We want to find the next constraint. That's also why maturity models aren't great, because once we've arrived, we're done. And then everyone else passes us by. Okay, also, leadership matters. We've taken a look quickly. I'll run through this quickly, I'm about out of time. We took a look at models of transformational leadership, and we have found that it's predictive. So in other areas, we did find, the literature shows that transformational leadership is predictive of outcomes. We wondered if that was also true in technology. Some people say, well, of course it's true, but other people say technology is so complex and so difficult it can't be. Here's what we found. It actually is predictive, as long as it follows these 5 dimensions. One is intellectual stimulation, right? So we help challenge the status quo, challenge people to think about new things. Another is inspirational communication. You can help inspire your team. Supportive leadership, right? We want to have leaders that are supportive of us. Also personal recognition. You could acknowledge good work and acknowledge your team personally. Another is vision. You know where your group and your team is going, and you can communicate that really well. Now, here's what this looks like. Here's what this means. So I'm not going to walk through the entire model, but this is the 2017 model. Transformational leadership is at the far left. Anytime you see an arrow in this model, that means predicts, drives. So it's at the far left not because it's most important, but because it underlies and undergirds the rest of the model. It helps amplify all of the rest of the work of the team, and then it flows through to the rest of IT performance and organizational performance. So a good leader helps amplify the rest of the work of the team. I'm sure we've all seen this in our work, right? A good leader helps make everything else amazing and amplify the work of the rest of the team. But a bad leader can detract, right? Imagine if that's a negative arrow. It can make everything else kind of sucky and kind of bad, right? Okay, so here's what we can do. We can help. We can be transformational leaders. A leader doesn't have to be a manager. We can all help. We can measure a few things, focus on outcomes. We can drive performance improvements, think about tech, but also think about not tech. We can share our stories. Evangelize this internally. Start small. Think about one team that you influence. Grow it from there. Support some efforts across your organization. You can do meetups. You can do hack days. We can share our stories. Now, if you want more, email NicoleFV@sendyourslides.com, subject DevOps. Okay, I'm going to say that again, NicoleFV@sendyourslides.com, and you'll get an email with a whole bunch of stuff. You'll get a free excerpt out of Accelerate, the Science of DevOps. We are doing a free signing, but I know we have limited copies of the book, so you'll get a free excerpt. You'll get this presentation. You'll get a free ROI white paper on forecasting the value of DevOps. You'll get a metrics guidance white paper. You'll get a tactics for leading change white paper, and you'll get an ACMQ article on DevOps metrics about good strategies for measuring DevOps. And I am totally over time, so I apologize. But thank you so much for sticking around. I really appreciate everyone's time today.